You've probably been told that staying comfortable past 80 comes down to good genes, that some men just get lucky with a cooperative prostate, and the rest of us are simply stuck with what we were dealt. That's not actually true. I believed it myself for years, right up until I actually looked closely at what the genuinely comfortable men in their 80s had in common, and luck turned out to have almost nothing to do with it. I'm 83. I spent my 70s bracing myself every time I sat down for longer than 20 minutes, certain the pressure would build the way it always did. In the next few minutes, I'll walk you through the 5 things I eventually pieced together, small on their own, but together they changed how my whole day feels. These days I can sit through a full sermon, a long dinner with the grandkids, a whole afternoon of fishing without that familiar pressure creeping in and stealing my attention. I'm not telling you that to brag. I'm telling you because for years I assumed comfort like that simply belonged to other men, not to me, and I was wrong about that. The discomfort had been part of my life for so long I'd stopped questioning it. A dull pressure low in my belly by early afternoon, nights broken up 2 or 3 times, a stream that had gone from something I never thought about to something I had to plan around. I told myself, the way a lot of men do, that this was simply what 80 looked like from the inside, a body that presses on itself in uncomfortable places, and there's nothing much to be done except accept it and carry on. What changed my thinking was a conversation with my daughter's father-in-law, a retired urologist I'd met at a family wedding years earlier and stayed in touch with since. We got to talking one afternoon about why some of his older patients seemed to sail through their 80s barely noticing their prostate at all, while others, like me, seemed to struggle with it constantly. He told me it was rarely one single thing. It was almost always a small handful of ordinary daily habits, stacked together, working on inflammation and comfort from several different directions at once. He said the biggest mistake he saw men make was hunting for one miracle fix, one pill, one food, one supplement, when the men who actually stayed comfortable into their 80s and 90s had usually built a small system instead, nothing dramatic on its own, but consistent enough that the pieces reinforced each other day after day, year after year. He told me about 2 patients of his, both in their mid-80s, both retired from physical jobs, both with prostates that had grown noticeably on imaging over the years. One of them barely mentioned any discomfort at checkups. The other complained every single visit, the pressure, the broken sleep, the planning his whole day around bathrooms. He said the difference wasn't the size of the gland on the scan. It was almost entirely what each man did with his ordinary days, the small, boring, repeatable choices that added up over years rather than weeks. That distinction rattled around in my head for days afterward. I'd always assumed comfort or discomfort in old age was mostly handed to you, the way eye color or height gets handed to you, fixed and largely out of your hands. Hearing that 2 men with similarly enlarged prostates could have such different daily experiences based mostly on habit rather than anatomy was the first thing that actually made me want to change something instead of just enduring it. The first habit he pointed to surprised me the most, because I'd heard of it before and dismissed it as something for arthritis, not for anything below the belt. He told me about a specific golden spice, the kind that gives curry its color, that research has connected to a real, measurable improvement in urinary comfort scores when used alongside standard prostate management, not replacing anything, just supporting it. The mechanism, he explained, ties back to inflammation. A lot of the pressure and discomfort men feel isn't really about size alone, it's about ongoing low-grade inflammation in and around the gland. And this particular compound has a well-documented anti-inflammatory effect throughout the body. For years, one number ran my life, the PSA. It would tick up a point and I'd lie awake the whole night, certain it meant the worst, picturing the biopsy, the knife, the end of everything. Then someone finally told me the truth no doctor had. That number doesn't measure cancer, it measures your prostate. And as we age, it climbs mostly because the gland is simply enlarging, benign, swollen, and uncomfortable, not the worst. The number was scaring me half to death over something ordinary. And the prescriptions they push to shrink it? They can flatten your drive completely, soften everything, quietly take the man right out of you. I wasn't willing to trade that away. There's a gentle way to support that gland, keep it comfortable, a healthy size, without surrendering any of that. Keep getting checked every year, of course. At 83, that number doesn't own me anymore. I finally have peace. Let me show you what gave it to me in this video. And if you want the simple support I personally use, there's a free presentation linked in the description below. So here's the system I actually built once he laid it out for me. 5 habits, working together with that golden spice sitting right at the center of it. First, I started taking a curcumin supplement daily, the concentrated form of that golden spice, specifically formulated to actually absorb well, since he warned me plain turmeric powder from the spice rack doesn't absorb into the body nearly as effectively on its own. Second, I committed to a 20-minute walk most mornings, nothing strenuous, just consistent, because inflammation and circulation both respond to regular movement in ways that matter more than people realize. Third, I cut back hard on processed food, the packaged snacks, the fried takeout I used to grab twice a week without thinking twice, all of it contributing to the same inflammatory load the curcumin was working against. Fourth, I spread my water intake evenly across the day, instead of drinking most of it in the evening, tapering off after dinner so my bladder wasn't working overtime right when I was trying to sleep. And fifth, I actually prioritized my sleep, a real, consistent bedtime, because he explained that poor sleep and chronic stress elevate the same inflammatory signals that curcumin was helping to calm, working against everything else I was doing if I let it slide. None of these 5 pieces would have meant much standing alone. I want to be honest about that. The curcumin without the walking, or the walking without cutting the processed food, would likely have moved the needle only a little. It was the whole system, held steady for a few months, that actually changed how my days felt. I won't pretend it was simple to build all at once. I started with just the curcumin and the walking in the first 2 weeks, because trying to change 5 things simultaneously at 83 felt like setting myself up to fail at all of them. Cutting the processed food came next, and that one stung more than I expected. I'd built 30 years of habits around the same handful of easy packaged dinners, and relearning simple cooking took real effort, plus a few burnt attempts my wife still teases me about. The water timing and the sleep schedule came last, mostly because they required the most discipline in the moment, right when I least wanted to exercise any. The processed food habit was the one that nearly derailed everything. I'd grown up in a generation that treated a full pantry of canned soup and frozen dinners as a kind of security, something my mother's generation had never had the luxury of taking for granted, and giving that up felt oddly like giving up a small piece of comfort I'd earned. My wife, to her credit, met me halfway. She started cooking simpler meals herself, more vegetables, less out of a box, and made it feel like something we were doing together rather than a restriction I alone had to endure. That mattered more than I expected it to. The sleep schedule was its own battle entirely. I'd fallen into the habit over the years of staying up later than I should, telly on, half dozing in the recliner until nearly midnight before finally dragging myself to bed. Committing to a real bedtime, lights out by 10 most nights, felt at first like something being taken from me rather than given. It took nearly a month before my body actually started cooperating with the earlier hour instead of fighting it. The mechanism made sense once it was all laid out plainly, piece by piece. Curcumin works on inflammation directly. Walking supports circulation and helps regulate the same inflammatory pathways from a different angle. Cutting processed food removes a steady source of dietary inflammation that had been working against everything else I was trying to do. Spreading out my water intake, rather than front-loading it in the evening, reduces the nighttime bladder load directly. And real sleep keeps the whole inflammatory system calmer overall, which supports every other piece of the system rather than undermining it. By the 4th week, I noticed the afternoon pressure showing up later than it used to, and a little less intensely when it did show up. By the 8th week, some days it barely registered at all. By the 12th week, my nighttime trips had dropped from 3 most nights to 1, sometimes none. I kept a small notebook by my chair, nothing fancy, just a line most evenings, mostly so I wouldn't talk myself into believing progress that wasn't actually there. Reading back through those pages months later is what finally convinced me this wasn't wishful thinking on my part. Last month I sat through my granddaughter's entire piano recital, nearly 2 hours between the performance and the reception afterward, without once needing to slip out and find a bathroom the way I would have a couple of years earlier. She asked me afterward if I'd enjoyed the whole thing, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the honest answer was yes, every minute of it. I think often about a man named Everett, who wrote to me after an earlier video, 82. a retired high school football coach who told me he'd spent years assuming his discomfort was simply the price of a body that had taken plenty of hits over the decades, on the field and off it. He'd tried a supplement or two on his own before, always in isolation, always giving up after a few weeks when nothing dramatic happened. When he heard about building a whole system instead of chasing one miracle ingredient, he told me it was the first explanation that actually matched what he'd observed in his own body, that nothing alone had ever moved the needle much, but he'd never tried stacking several small things together on purpose. Everett started with the curcumin and cutting back on fried food, the two changes that felt most manageable to him at first. Over the following 2 months, he layered in the morning walks, the water timing, and finally a real bedtime, one piece every couple of weeks rather than trying to overhaul everything overnight the way he might have as a younger man used to pushing through discomfort all at once. He told me the improvement crept in so gradually that he almost missed it, a little less pressure here, one fewer bathroom trip there, until one afternoon at his grandson's football game, standing the entire second half on the sideline the way he used to when he coached, he realized he hadn't thought about his prostate once the whole game. He also told me something that stuck with me. He said the biggest shift wasn't physical, though the physical relief mattered plenty. It was realizing he'd spent years assuming discomfort was simply a fixed cost of turning 80, something owed and non-negotiable, when in fact it had been responding the whole time to ordinary, correctable daily habits he'd simply never stacked together before. Everett also admitted something that made me laugh, because I thought the exact same thing myself. He said part of him had resisted the whole idea at first because it sounded too simple to actually work. Curcumin, walking, cutting back on fried food, drinking water at the right times, going to bed earlier. None of it sounded impressive enough to matter, not compared to the surgery his brother had gone through a few years back, or the medications his neighbor took every morning. But he said that was exactly the trap so many men fall into, assuming that if a solution isn't dramatic, it can't be real. In his case, and in mine, the ordinary system turned out to be the thing that actually worked, month after month, long after the novelty of trying something new had worn off. If you're on medication for your prostate, your blood pressure, your blood thinners, or anything else, please talk with your doctor before adding curcumin or any new supplement, since it can interact with certain medications, including blood thinners specifically. And please, keep up with your regular prostate checkups without exception, every single year. No skipping. None of this replaces that care. It's something real you do alongside it, in the months between visits. What I want you to walk away with is this. The men who seem to sail through their 80s without much prostate discomfort usually aren't the beneficiaries of luck or genetics alone. A real number of them have quietly built a small system of ordinary habits, stacked together, working on the same underlying inflammation from several directions at once. That's not me telling you to overhaul your entire life overnight. It's me telling you there's a real, gentle system here, one piece at a time, well within your reach. Here's what I settled on, a few drops a day. And let me tell you why it works. One compound calms one signal, but a swollen prostate answers when several are calmed at once. The growth signal, the inflammation, the pressure inside it. So what I use concentrates them, working as one, the way the research actually uses them, not a single ingredient pretending to be enough. A gland that stays comfortable and a healthy size, fewer trips, and the quiet of no longer fearing that number. It leaves the man fully intact, none of that flattening the prescriptions can do. It's linked right under this video, go look for yourself. It won't replace your doctor or your yearly check. It supports the biology right alongside them. I'm 83, and that number doesn't own me anymore. I think about the man I was, bracing myself every time I sat down too long, certain the pressure was simply the unavoidable cost of getting old. And I think about the man I am now, who sits through a whole recital or a whole ball game without his own body pulling his attention away from the people he loves. That's not a miracle. That's 5 ordinary habits held together long enough to finally matter. If you've ever assumed discomfort like this was simply unavoidable after 80, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every one myself. And if this kind of honest, practical explanation is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. There's more of this coming every week.